Hello and welcome.
Hello and welcome.
Mr. Shaw,
Mrs. Womack.
coming back at you. This time we're talking about Chapter 13 and the budget. Miss Womack's favorite. Fun fact about Miss Womack: she hates budgeting, and she takes.
It's funny because it's true.
And she takes that hatred out on the federal budget. Sorry, too close? Too close?
Fine.
Okay. All right, so guys, today we're going to be talking about all kinds of stuff, but we're going to start with describe the sources of funding for the federal government and assess the consequences of tax expenditures and borrowing. So,
So here we see an overview of the federal budget. Notice that the blue portion is shorter than the gray portion, which means that our revenues, the money coming into the federal government, is much less than how much money the federal government actually spends, which means that we are deficit spending almost every year, pretty much every year since like 2000-ish.
has been since 2000.
So we are in debt is what that means. And because of that, it just puts us further into debt every year.
And this has really just been in the past 20 years or so. Like the spending has changed dramatically. We'll talk more about that later. But this is just kind of giving you an idea of what happens and how the debt actually works.
And where do most of our revenues come from, the federal government?
That's a great question. It's from the 16th Amendment.
Oh, okay.
So the personal and corporate income tax, first of all, personal taxes was passed with the 16th Amendment. Again, and it was done in 1913. A lot of controversy around this. There's like some states that like passed it like in super shady ways, but whatever. Again, this creates the Internal Revenue Service and 150 million individual income tax returns. And that's really, if you make any money, you have to report that to the government.
And so you probably noticed that your parents, or even you, if you have a job, by April 15th every year, you're supposed to have your taxes done. And then you will see if you paid too much in taxes, you'll get a little bit back from the government. If you didn't pay enough, then you have to pay more to the government. And so that's what all this is kind of coming out of.
Correct. And so again, the progressive, just as Ms. Womack said, the income tax is progressive, meaning that as you make more, you have to pay more. And right now our rates are about anywhere from like 10% to about 40%.
And that depends on how much you make?
Yes.
Okay.
The 40% is actually a lot. Again, it sounds super high. It's actually really low. We have one of the lowest tax rates in the world.
Right.
Well, I mean, among developed nations.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so personal and corporate income tax. So there is kind of a difference between the two. And so this slide's just kind of covering who pays the taxes. So 45% of people don't pay any taxes. Ooh. Those are going to be... Go ahead. I mean, so depending on the tax legislation that's currently in place, and right now our tax legislation that is in place gives more breaks to corporations and people with wealthier incomes, and there's a reason for that. It's the idea that if they're paying less in taxes, then they're kind of letting that wealth trickle down into the rest of the economy, and it's supposed to be beneficial for the rest of us. So because you're probably thinking, well, why aren't people who are making more money paying more taxes? Well, there's a reason for that. But between 1% paid 35% of the taxes, and then 10% paid 68% of the taxes. So it just depends on kind of what tax category you fall into. And again, it depends on how much money you make individually. And then one of the vocab terms in this chapter is a flat tax rate. And that's going to be kind of the opposite of progressive. So it would be where everyone in the country pays the exact same amount, no matter how much money you make. It could be more money for the government, but in the United States, we don't see that as kind of like a practical tax solution, I guess.
Part of the issue is that, again, wealthier people tend to argue that they pay too much, like that. Right. Again, they have earned that money, and that them having to pay a higher rate is really unfair. And a lot of people, probably wealthier people, really don't trust the government to use their money wisely. And so that is really kind of the big argument. And the reason why they support the flat tax system is so, okay, everybody's going to pay the same. and then there's no loopholes, no
Right.
nothing, like, and so that would actually be more money for the federal government, again, according to that argument. The other thing I wanted to mention too about up here, when you say 45% paid no taxes, a lot of that is about the 50%, the bottom 50% paid 3% of taxes. So like if you make like below a certain amount of money, like for example, like I don't know, less than $15,000, for example, taking 10% of that is going to be $1,500. Like the government doesn't necessarily want to take that money when you already are making a super low amount of money.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily like, yes, there are people who are using tax loopholes and things like that. However, even the top 1% that are using a bunch of loopholes, they're still ending up paying, 35% of the taxes.
One more thing about the 45% that pay no taxes. Some people do not have income at all. If you're on government disability, or if you're a wounded veteran or something, and you're literally living off of government money or funding, you're not going to pay taxes on that because the government is providing you with your income. So you don't have to pay taxes on that. So that's also going to be incorporated into that 45%.
I was really hoping you were going to say teachers, that if you're not making any income, like teachers. Oh, sorry. It's a little too close to home. Okay. Again, so this is just going to show you the federal revenue and just kind of how where we go from here. So like you talk about this bottom part is individual income taxes, and you see that this is going to make up the biggest chunk of the government income. Corporate income taxes, again, like it is larger. However, it's not, again, you would think that this would be a lot higher just because corporations are making a ton of money.
Yeah.
But again, a lot of times, especially conservatives, when they don't want corporations paying that much in taxes because they want them reinvesting that back into the economy. Excise taxes, again, we're not super concerned about that. But the social insurance taxes and contributions, though, again, that's a huge part.
Huge.
And you can check your pay stub next time you guys get paid. You'll see things like social security tax and then Medicare taxes, things like that. And that's all going to help fund, the current generation who is retired. It's going to fund their retirement.
And notice how it is steadily increasing, but it does fluctuate. And that kind of depends on who the president is and who is in control of Congress and what their kind of theory on taxation is. Conservatives tend to lower taxes. Progressives tend to increase taxes. And so that's why it's kind of going up and down, especially since mid-90s, 2000-ish.
Sure.
Kind of going up and down.
Well, and I'm really interested here to I would have thought the 80s would have gone down a lot more.
Yeah.
But I mean, just because of the Reaganomics and the Reagan tax cuts, but interestingly, it doesn't until it goes up in the 90s with Clinton, which doesn't make much sense either.
Because we weren't deficit spending under him, but then we hit 9/11 and we get into a war, and it's ugh.
Yeah, and then now the government again, and this really can just show you the size of the government, whatever this graph is going to look like is going to show you really the power of the government, and you can see that our government in the last 50 years has really increased to just a behemoth.
Yeah, I mean, people expect the government to do more. Yeah, which means the government has to spend more money.
And it's harder too if they are going to be cutting their income, meaning their the taxes, the tax income. Okay. So social insurance taxes, again, Social Security, that is the modest income for people who are 62 and over, or people who are disabled and cannot work. This was done in the Great Depression, again, to kind of keep the elderly people out of poverty. Medicare, it provides medical insurance for people who are 65 and older. Both of these are going to be matched by employers, and this provides about 1/3 of federal revenue. Again, these are entitlements. These are people pay into these their entire lives, and then they are entitled to that money. The government has to pay them that money, and this is really unsustainable. Like, we know now that there are fewer people that are paying into Social Security and Medicare, and again, that the boomer generation is now retiring. You can get your giggles out now. I don't know why baby boomers.
Well, the boomers are the biggest generation.
They are,
and they were paying into these programs when they were in the workforce, and now they're getting to the age where they're pulling from these programs because they're retired. But there are not as many people paying in. There are less of us paying into these programs, and so it is not sustainable at this point. We have to start thinking of ways where if we want to keep these programs going and if we want people to exit the workforce at a certain age so that we can free up jobs for younger people, we have to figure out a way to make it sustainable. And there's a variety of different things that have kind of been thrown out, but none of them have ever really stuck yet.
Because people want their money.
Right.
And we'll talk about those later.
Yep. All right. So tax revenue does not cover expenditures. So the government has things that they have to spend money on. And as we saw in the first slide, our revenues do not equal what the expenditures have become. And so again, we have deficit spending. The bonds thing, I think it's funny that we cover this.
Why?
I don't know. Some of you guys might have like a savings bond that grandma or grandpa got you as a child. And so those are almost like small little loans to the government. And so, my grandpa used to buy me savings bonds every birthday, and I don't even know where they are. I don't even know if we have them.
No.
My mom has to have
stop.
them somewhere.
You have to have them somewhere.
So you're giving the government money, and the idea is later down the road that will be worth more money, and you'll be able to get that money from the federal government.
So it works just like you would think of like at a bank. Like like you put money in a bank or in like a mutual fund, it earns interest over time. So the bond is the same way. So what you do is you give the government a loan essentially,
loan.
And they're going to like, okay, in 10 years we're going to give this back to you with a 5%, and it might not even be that much. I think it might be like 2 or 3%.
Yeah, I think it's 2.
Like and we're going to give you a certain percentage interest on your loan. And so people do it all the time. It's super safe. I mean, again, and this is the, one of the most popular ways to invest money, just because it's really safe. You're definitely going to get your money back. But that's the biggest debt that we have. It's a majority of the national debt is to American citizens.
Owes citizens.
That they owe it through bonds. So like when you hear people talk about like us owing China money, like we do owe China money, but that is
not as much as they make it seem.
Yeah, and it's like China. Let's say that like China, said they called in their debt and they're like, all right, U.S., you're going to pay us. Like, again, great. We can probably pay them everything that we owe them, and nothing really bad is going to happen because most of the money that we owe actually is just to American citizens.
Yeah. So national debt is about $28.7 trillion. Is that updated?
It is.
You updated that? Good job. That's a large number, guys. And remember, some debt is okay. Some debt is good. But 28.7 trillion, a lot of people see that as crippling.
Sure.
Or at least crippling for future generations. 9% of the federal spending are interest payments. So what that means is because we have such a large chunk of debt, that debt accumulates interest, and we, as part of our required spending every year, have to pay that interest. And so because a large chunk of our revenues go to that interest payment every year, it's almost just like a vicious cycle. It just keeps putting us more and more into the deficit spending category. And then the government yearly decides on a debt ceiling. And this is something that Congress usually votes on. And this is going to limit the government can borrow, how much the government can borrow to meet its legal obligations. And it seems like Congress kind of has to raise that every so often because we continue to spend more than what we have coming in for revenues. Spending increases when revenue declines. Obviously.
Like we make less money, we're going to have to make up. We still have to spend the same amount.
Absolutely. Because we have, what's the vocab term? The required?
Entitlements?
Yes. But there's a vocab term.
Mandatory.
Mandatory spending. So entitlements would fall under the mandatory spending category. So no matter what, every year we have to spend on Social Security, we have to spend on Medicaid, we have to spend on Medicare. And so those things are already coming off the top of our revenues. And then if we have less revenues coming in, like if we cut taxes or something for the American people and we have less revenues coming in, then we have to figure out where that money is coming from because the government still has to spend money every single year.
Quick thing about the national debt is like there's a growing number of people now that think that the national debt actually doesn't matter, because for years now people have thought that things were just going to start crumbling. Like when it was at $6 trillion, 10 trillion, 15 trillion, 20 trillion. There's like eventually something's going to happen, and you're not going to be able to you're not going to be able to continue.
Stay afloat.
Yeah, exactly, and that time hasn't occurred.
Yeah, we haven't. I mean, we just keep raising that debt.
Yeah,
nothing has really happened yet.
Yeah, and so that's part of the problem is just that we and again, like even if let's say that all the countries that we owe money to decided to call their debt to us. I mean, what are they going to do? Start World War III? I mean, we are we have the biggest economy in the world,
right.
And so like it's really hard to do that, because if our economy suffers, then their economies suffer, and nobody wants to go to war because of nuclear threats.
Plus, we spend more on our military yearly than the next 10 countries underneath of us combined. So you're not going to mess with the United States. You're going to do that. You're not going to mess with the United States and then have a potential military threat.
Yeah. Anyway, just a quick note. Again, if a person spent like the government does and operated with this much debt, obviously that's not sustainable.
Yeah.
However, we're not talking about a person anymore. We're talking about a government, and it just doesn't work the same way. So anyway. Again, you can see here kind of how the national debt has grown. So again, it really, like we talk about it being so large, it's really not, this is very new. That it is this large.
And again, notice that we hit like September 11th, and we get into a war and it kind of is a sharp spike there. And then we hit the financial crisis and it just keeps going up.
And again, two big things to point out. You see the two sharp increases have been from tax cuts. Again, when that happens, when taxes are cut, it sounds great for us, but the problem is that because of those entitlements, the government can't spend less money. Like people want lower taxes, but they don't want less things from the government. Yeah. So it's this weird thing that people like, it's like they're not going to be happy either way. So
lose.
Yeah. Okay. So we already kind of talked about these. So just want to kind of, or we didn't. Sorry, tax expenditures, meaning losses in federal revenue. These are basically like tax exemptions.
So like
for individuals.
So if when I go get my taxes done by an accountant and he says, okay, do you have any charitable contributions? If I gave a certain amount I donated a certain amount of clothing or whatever it might be to Goodwill, let's say, you can mark that as a charitable contribution, and that'll be kind of like a tax break, and you might get a little bit money back on your taxes for something like that.
Yeah. So like they can't tax that then.
Right.
So like, for example, charitable contributions, as Ms. Womack mentioned, mortgage interest, business equipment, and then that like those things can't be taxed by the government. Okay. So when that is gone, that's money the government is losing. But for individuals, it's nice because, again, the amount of taxes that the government can charge you is not as high.
Right.
It does definitely benefit the wealthy and businesses. Like if you have a business and you can just say, oh, well, I spent all this money, I bought new laptops. I bought new, whatever. Like the government can't then tax you on this. And obviously the businesses need a lot of stuff to function well. So this is one way that they can get a really big tax break. Tax reduction. These are, again, this is popular with some voters, but we all already kind of talked about this a little bit. This basically is a way to limit the size of the government, although I would argue that you can't really limit the size of the government anymore.
Not at this point that we are now.
Yeah.
Where the government is responsible for a multitude of things to take care of the American people.
Yeah, and so that, again, people like tax cuts, but it really does, it's the driving force behind the national debt. So just know that when you guys go to vote when you're older.
Oh, how big is the tax burden? Okay, I like this. Yeah. I like this because, you hear a lot of Americans complaining about taxes, but if you're looking around the world at where we kind of stand on how big our tax burden is, we fall pretty far down on the list. And, it kind of puts things into perspective, if you will. So you'll see at the top, the United States is 25% there. You go all the way down to Denmark. And you know, some of these are what we would consider like fully socialist countries where, you know, they provide universal health care and universal child care and universal, you know, college education or whatever it might be. But really, in the grand scheme of things, we're not so bad.
Our taxes are really low.
Yeah.
And again, the government does provide stuff for us, but not as much as other countries.
Yeah, and so, sorry, to give you a little context, this is tax revenues as a percent of the gross domestic product. So the gross domestic product is basically how much we make. Not how much we make, how much we sell. How much is going out.
Yeah. It's like the growth of our economy.
Yes.
Like as a Well, we have it later.
We do have the definition later. And so that's showing you the percentage of taxes in comparison to the gross domestic product that we have in the United States.
13.2.
We're only on 2.
Stop. Analyze federal expenditures and the growth of the budget. Sorry.
This is a big one.
Big governments, big budgets.
I like big budgets and I cannot lie.
Big government needs big money. Again, the standard, so the gross domestic product is the standard measure of the value added created through the production of goods and services in a country during a certain period. Sorry.
Lovely.
I should have said GDP here. This is the GDP definition that we just mentioned. Again, the one third of our GDP is spending by national, state, and local governments, and the national government spending is 1/5 of our gross domestic product.
25%.
Well, that's 20%.
20%.
But yes, it's close enough. So that's the thing. Like we talk about just like what the government does, and we have to spend a lot of money. And you just see like we have one of the largest gross domestic products in the world, but we need to be able to spend a huge percentage of that money in order to provide for the people, because that is the fundamental function of government. Again, the government has grown dramatically in the last 50 years. A lot of the reasons before that are the public demand. People want more from the government. You think of things like Medicare, Medicaid. Again, there's a huge push now for better health care. Changes in economy. Again, you think of the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. That has grown the size of the government because they stepped in to bail out banks and big corporations and people. Even now with COVID is a great example. Mm-hmm. You talk about like the stimulus checks. Like these things, like that money has to come from somewhere. And so yes, it's great to get that little extra boost. However, it's gonna hurt if we can't raise revenue in some way, it's going to hurt the deficit. Changes in social conditions, again, kind of same thing here. Economic downturns, I already talked about that. Urbanization, pollution, again, you talk about all these things that the government is now in charge of. You think of,
climate change.
the Environmental Protection Agency is huge now just because there's a lot of problems that they have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge push in the last several years with like the government needing to take care of the effects of climate change that are going on. And so that costs money, right? We have to figure out some way to curb these effects of climate change. And we're kind of relying on the government to figure that out. And that's going to cost money. We have to spend money to do that.
It's funny they rely on the government instead of corporations.
Well, that's a whole nother subject.
Okay, so this is the similar one you saw earlier for federal expenditures. Again, this is what the government is spending. So again, you see national defense has been pretty much the same until the war in Afghanistan started. Net interest, again, has been big spike after the war started as well because we had to take out more money. Payments for individuals, so that's talking about Social Security and Medicare. Entitlements. Again, you see this is just skyrocketed. Huge. A lot of that is because of the boomer generation retiring. And then other non-defense. I love this one. This is everything else that the government is spending. Doesn't that shock you? You think about everything else. Like this literally is just defense, interest, Social Security and Medicare, and then literally everything else. Like education is in here somewhere, and again, that's different because that's mostly a state issue. But again, that's people don't really realize like how crazy that actually looks or what that actually looks like.
Yeah. All right. The rise of national security states. So, we hit about the Cold War era and we start to see this permanent military establishment. So we start focusing heavily on military spending. We get to something called the military industrial complex, which is the relationship between a nation's military and the defense industry that supplies it, seen together as a vested interest which influences public policy. So it's kind of like this relationship where our defense industry, so gun manufacturers and tank, just in any given kind of anything that would fall into that military equipment category. Like Boeing. Very good. They are going to supply the government with necessary defense supplies and equipment. And it's this kind of relationship that we've had. And we've really seen that. We really put emphasis on that as a country since probably the Cold War.
Well, now it's like they're in bed together.
Yeah.
Like they can't get
in bed together.
Sorry, I don't know. Is that inappropriate?
I don't know.
Whatever.
I repeated it.
And so again, like the
now it's
industry,
like stuck. We're stuck.
Yeah, the industry and the corporations, like they don't want their profits to go down,
right?
And the government doesn't necessarily, like, again, this kind of depends on your ideology too. Like they don't want to be seen as weak. Like no politician wants to be like, oh, we should just dismantle the military like that. It looks bad. Yeah. And now we have this thing that we are now producing, Black Hawk helicopters and things like that
and
we don't necessarily
that
need.
Those are not needed. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, that's not what we're trying to get into.
Right.
Like it's just like the reality is that this is a financial relationship that is mutually beneficial. However, it's really hard, especially now that of course with Afghanistan being taken over by the Taliban, like that is definitely worrisome. However, we're not in a war anymore. And like why? So
we were spending a couple $1 trillion a year, at least, in that area, and so that will be something that hopefully, though, that budget can kind of go towards something else if we need it.
Well, I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
But again, that's the thing is like that much spending, this much on the military and because the industries are benefiting so much, like is that really necessary during peacetime?
Yeah. And so you'll see it did decrease until 9/11, and that was a general time of peace. And then we hit 9/11 and we get into these different wars, and that's when we're going to see the military spending kind of go up again. 1/5 of the federal budget today is military spending, but there's a bunch of different reasons for that. Not only is it on equipment and stuff like that, but we also have so many members in our military that that money goes towards their pension. So when you do your military duty and then you get to the point where you can kind of retire, you're going to get money. You're going to get monthly payments from our government, and that comes out of the military budget as well. And then cost overruns. So things that we think are going to cost X amount of money that end up actually costing a lot more than that. And maybe we budgeted for this amount, but we ended up spending a lot more than that. And so that's what cost overruns are going to be too, with different military expenses.
It's like when you budget for a golf cart and it ends up costing more than you budgeted.
Whatever.
Hashtag golf cart life. Okay, so trends in national defense spending. Again, so as Ms. Womack was talking about, again, usually it varies as far as if we're in a war or not,
right,
or if we have conflicts going on. So this is today's dollars and current dollars. Okay. So it's weird that this spike doesn't hardly ever even increases it in today's dollars.
Yeah.
So this was Vietnam, and then back here, this is in the 80s. This was the Star Wars program, probably with Reagan, trying to end the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And then you see the Cold War ends here, and then boom, we get to the 2000s war in Afghanistan, and we're back. And it's really been up. I wish that we could have seen a more up to date chart here too, because I think that would have helped. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, I was just going to point out and remember that in the early 2000s, we see a tax cut too. So if you're kind of putting this in context, we cut taxes so we have less government revenues coming in, and then we start spending tremendously on defense, and so that we see the deficit just skyrocket at that point.
Same thing in the 80s.
Yes.
It's my turn, right?
I don't know.
I think it's my turn.
I think we've
You
both
went the
just
last
been
one.
going back
You
and
went the
forth.
last
You're
one.
fine.
It's fine.
fine.
Okay, so the rise of the social service state, I talked about this a little earlier, so I don't have definitions for Social Security and Medicare again for you. We already talked about those. And then this, but what it is an intergenerational contract. So the idea is like, so for example, like Ms. Womack and I are in our 30s, like we are paying for, now I guess we don't technically pay Social
Yeah,
Security.
teachers are different.
But regardless, let's imagine that we were like bartenders. Like, so then we are going to be paying, what do you want to be? You want to
I want to be like an event planner.
event planner.
I'm an
Okay.
event planner.
That sounds lovely. I'll go dibs on corporate CEO. Why
Oh,
didn't
perfect.
you go?
Well, then you
should've
got all
gone
these
way bigger.
loopholes for
Okay,
your taxes. So.
I'm kidding. I'll be a bartender. So again, like we would be paying into Social Security, and that money is going to then be used to pay for the current people who are 62 and older, who are retired. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so
Yeah.
what happens is, people hit 62 years old and then they'll start getting checks from the government. And the idea here is that they then can release themselves from the workforce and still live off of that money that they've been paying into Social Security and still live off of that money and kind of live out the rest of their lives comfortably, or at least close to what the living that they had prior to retiring. Because again, they've been paying into it their entire adult lives as they've had a job or a career or whatever it might be. And that kind of frees up space for younger people to come into the workforce. But because the generation that is taking out of that account is so large right now and people are living longer, there's a bunch of different things that are going into it. That account, that Social Security account, is dwindling quickly.
And to be clear, it's not a lot of money. Like they're not getting, thousands and thousands of dollars a month.
No.
Like it's probably like $1,000 a month.
Right. It's gonna be like proportional and like a percentage of what they were making.
Is it?
I think so.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought it was like a flat part. I thought it was flat.
It's not.
Okay.
I just know.
Oh, she knows things.
I know things. But see, the idea is if you can keep, if you hit 62 and you can keep working, the longer you work, the more your Social Security payments will be after you retire. I promise.
Okay, I believe you.
Yeah.
I believe you.
Because Bridget, my mother, my class already probably knows who Bridget is. But
Bridget.
she's going to just keep on working. Because then once she retires, then those Social Security payments will be more monthly.
Interesting. And again, we talk about, Ms. Womack just mentioned the more beneficiaries than workers thing. Some options that we have to fix this unsustainability. Again, we mentioned like we could raise that age at the age of 62. We could raise it to like say 67 maybe,
Yeah.
or 65. And then that way that's like you're not going to get it until later. Also, people are living longer. So, you can continue to be in the workforce longer. You can lower the amount of money that people get.
Yes.
Also, you can exempt certain people from getting money, like Bill Gates. When he retires, he will get Social Security. Now,
Yeah.
and again,
Or like
he doesn't
people
need
who
it.
are
Like,
already getting military pensions, or if you have some other form of income that you're already getting,
yeah.
you may be exempt, or maybe you qualify for less Social Security
Yeah.
payments.
Like we will get pensions as teachers,
Yes.
and maybe that could disqualify us. Again, this is just theoretical, though.
Yeah.
But a lot of people they rely on that money. They
Yeah.
like my dad, when he's talking about when he wants to retire, he factors in like his 401k
Mm-hmm.
and the amount of money that he's going to get with Social Security. So people are just they're counting on it, and the problem is that eventually like that money is not going to be there.
Right.
Like you guys probably won't ever see a dime of it if we don't fix it now.
Yeah.
Or-
and so
or
another
soon.
option would be to require a bigger payment from the people who are paying into it,
Right.
which is another burden on the workforce.
Yeah, and that again, especially if you think about like when you're younger, you have less money.
Yeah.
Like it's just not really feasible.
Yeah.
But anyway, we'll see what happens. Okay, so trends in social service spending. Again, this really, man,
Everything just keeps going up. Everything just keeps going up.
I love the money ones just because it's so easy just to say, okay, everything keeps increasing. Again, you see kind of just what's going on here. Again, this, and I bet that this number would just keep skyrocketing,
rising.
Especially as you talk about the expansions in Medicaid and things like that. Yeah,
I mean, look at 2003 prescription drug benefit added to Medicare, so that's going to cost more money.
Yep.
We're going to keep spending more.
And then increased spending. I couldn't. This is not going anywhere. And the only way to really combat this is to raise taxes. However, taxes are very unpopular in America. Yeah. Also among politicians because they know that their constituents don't want higher taxes.
Ugh. Okay, so incrementalism. So in any given year, the best predictor of that next year's budget is going to be what we spent the year prior to. And so each year, though, each government agency, so you have a large bureaucracy. Have we gone through bureaucracy yet? No.
We have not.
We have not. So the federal government is made up of all these different agencies, right, and bureaucracies, and each of them are going to want a certain amount of money for their budget every year, and Congress and the president both have to kind of look at those things, and these agencies are going to go to Congress and the president and say, we want X amount of money, and they're always going to ask for more than what they're assuming they're going to get, because that's a good strategy. Because, you start high and then you go down from there. But anyway, every year those budgets, for whatever reason, those budgets are going to need to increase, right? So we need more money. The EPA needs more money because we have to fight climate change. It's just a kind of an example to give you. But anyway, we use the current year's budget or the last year's budget to try to make the next year's budget, and then we kind of adjust from there. Exceptions here are NASA and defense. So NASA, it kind of fluctuates depending on what kind of programs are going on in NASA, right?
I think it was more specific, like after the Cold War.
Okay. That's we reduced spending at NASA
correct,
after the Cold War because, we made it to the moon. We hit the goal, So let's drop NASA, right? No. And then defense, though, again, as we talked about prior to, during the Cold War, we were heavy spending. It kind of drops, and then we hit 9/11 and get into some wars again, and then it kind of goes up again. So things fluctuate.
Defense will be kind of just about what foreign policy issues are we dealing with right now, and then that's so that really doesn't follow incrementalism very well.
Right.
So when we talk about uncontrollable expenditures, again, the budget is uncontrollable because 2/3 of it is automatic. Again, you talk about the interest, you talk about entitlements. These are things that the government has to pay. It's mandatory spending. We should have gone back to that slide where that little tiny part that you saw at the very top of the graph, that was discretionary spending. That's the only thing that they have that they can actually choose where money goes. So 2/3 of it is it's automatic. You have to pay it. Again, the interest on the national debt, if you default, again, you're going to be defaulting to the American people for the most part, which they're not likely to vote for you if you don't pay them. And then same thing with entitlements.
Yep.
Again, I think that's why they call it uncontrollable. And it's really, honestly, I don't envy congressmen trying to do this.
It's a very difficult task.
Yeah, anybody who's gonna do well with the budget might lose their jobs the next election.
That you have to walk.
Yeah.
Okay. Outline the budgetary process and explain the role that politics plays. Okay, budgetary politics. So budgets determine who gets what, when, and how. Again, we can actually just touch on this. It's a very fine line, right? So if, I'm a senator or I'm a member of the House of Representatives and I'm representing certain constituents, I have to know, when and where and how, if I'm going to vote on tax increases or tax cuts or whatever it might be. It's a fine line that they have to walk, but without increasing the national debt too much, because that's a huge topic as well. Strategies. Agencies always pad their budgets. I already kind of touched on this, requests, assuming they won't get all the money they asked for. So obviously these different agencies within the executive branch, within the federal government, they're going to ask for more money every year. They're going to go, hey, Congress, we need all this money for all these different things. And then Congress is going to kind of adjust from there and cut down as needed. The general process for the budget, the president is going to work with the Office of Management and Budget, and he is going to come up with a proposed budget. And it's kind of silly. It's almost like a formality.
Yeah.
It's not, because the president doesn't have a huge control over this at all. It's Congress who's the deciding factor. But he or she is going to work with the Office of Management and Budget. They're going to come up with a proposed budget. Congress is going to look at that, and they're going to adjust heavily from there. They're going to make changes where they see fit. But the president does have to give a final approval on that. So once Congress kind of agrees on something, they send it to the president, and the president's going to sign off on that. We have seen multiple times in the past, in the recent past, where Congress and the president cannot agree on a budget. And because of that, we have seen government shutdowns, which means that these, federal agencies, even like national parks, like little things like that, because they don't agree on a budget and they don't agree on, this amount of money should be designated for these different areas, the government literally shuts down. These people, these federal workers, these bureaucrats just stop working.
They can't technically stop working.
It depends on where they work.
Yeah.
Some of them stop working. Some of them continue to work with the hopes that they will get back pay for what they're doing. And most of the time they do. The president and Congress have always eventually come to an agreement because somebody has to back down at some point.
Right. Well, and it's like if you think of like President Trump with the wall,
yes,
like
he was very adamant.
He knew that he figured out that he wasn't going to be able to get the wall put into the budget, so he had to use an executive order later, and then they passed the budget and the shutdown ended.
Right, but it was a very long shutdown at that point. We were really at a stalemate there, and a lot of the times you'll see this when Congress and the president are not in the same party, or at least one house of Congress is not the same party as the president.
What's that called?
Divided government.
Good job.
Thank you.
Okay, so here's some magic.
Ah.
All right, so this is the budget process. Again, we talked about this a lot, but just the two of us and trying to figure out what of this you actually need to know. So the big takeaway that we decided on was that you need to know, first of all, that it's really complicated, that there's a lot of people involved, especially the agencies. Like everybody wants their cut. They are going to be lobbying very, very hard with the president, with congressmen, to try to show their value and to show why they need certain things. Interest groups are also going to be playing a large role in this. I don't think we've gotten to, I think we mentioned iron triangles before, but this is really where iron triangles are going to shine because they are everybody's going to be working really hard to get the president and Congress to actually give them the money that they want. So I am not super concerned about you getting this in your notes.
No.
I would, if you wanted to, though, it's on page 399 in your book.
I think it's more beneficial just to see the visual of how complicated the whole process is and how many players are involved.
Yeah, maybe just get the general, if you wanted to get something, maybe just get the general, the boxes in, not even the actual descriptions.
Yeah.
I think that's fine, though, to be honest with you. Yeah. Okay. Oops. Okay, so the president's budget, again, the president used to play a really limited role. Actually, the president had no involvement before 1921, which Ms. Womack and I did not know.
Yeah.
Again, that Budget and Accounting Act changed that, and now the president proposes the budget. But again, it really doesn't matter in a lot of ways because Congress is the one that they have the power of the purse. They are the ones that are actually going to be determining who gets what. I wonder why they did that in 1921. I can't imagine. It's not
after World War I.
Wait,
I don't know.
It was William Harding, who was a terrible president. So
Weird.
I don't know. Regardless, again, he's going to prepare the budget with the help of the Office of Management and Budget. That's literally all they do year round, and which is such a strange job because it doesn't even matter. So again. Again, what a weird job to have. Man, I want that job. Okay, so budget schedule, it's due the first Monday in February, and the process begins a year in advance. So next February, when you guys are, you'll be seeing a ton of stuff about the negotiations and all of this stuff, and they'll finally try to actually like hammer it out, and who knows? I guess we'll see. So it's going to be the government's going to be all Democrats still, so it'll probably actually be pretty easy this time
Yeah.
around anyway. But who knows? We'll see how it always people always throw wrenches and things. So okay.
Congress and the budget. So as we know, Congress has the power of the purse. Okay, so Congress is the one who allocates funding in these different areas, and who signs off on that stuff. So one of the vocab terms is budget resolution. I think that's a vocab term.
So, yes, it is. So, budget resolution is passing a budget.
Right. Passing the budget
Yeah.
in general. And that's where we kind of get the snags with
Yes.
the shutdowns and stuff like that when we can't pass a budget. A bunch of other kind of smaller vocab terms then. Reconciliation, changes to laws and authorizations that will enable Congress to stick to its budget ceiling. So every year, again, we said that Congress kind of votes on what the budget ceiling will be. Sometimes it has to increase. A lot of times it has to increase. So that's going to be a reconciliation that they have to kind of come to an agreement with. Authorization bills are approving spending limits for government agencies and programs. So give me an example of a government agency or program.
EPA.
Okay, so the EPA has to, Congress has to allocate this funding for the EPA for these different areas, or maybe whatever. It doesn't have to be super specific, or sometimes it is, whatever it might be. But that's an authorization bill. Appropriations bills then, providing actual funding, the actual agencies and programs.
So
Two actual agencies and programs?
they provide actual funding. Yeah, probably two.
Two.
Sorry. So there's two parts to it. In order for anybody in the government to get money, Congress first has to authorize it with an authorization bill. Then they have to appropriate it, meaning actually give it to
Designate.
them in an appropriations bill. This
Yeah.
should say actual funding to the actual agencies and programs.
Yes.
My bad.
That's okay. Continuing resolutions and approve the use of last year's budget again for current year. So again, we touched on that just slightly. This is if they can't, like if they're not going to increase anything, they're just going to say, continue, here's a continued resolution. You get the same budget for what you used last year.
If they're in a bind and they're way behind and they're looking to make a deal.
What is that from?
The devil went down to Georgia.
Oh, yeah. But so that's kind of why, it would be important if I was, in charge of a certain agency, I would make sure that I spent every dime that Congress appropriated to me from last year, because I don't want to spend less and then Congress go, oh, well, you don't need as much money this year, right? So you spend the money if you got it. If you don't use it, you lose it.
I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the actual budget process. Like, again,
Yeah. It's just
if
important
you want
for
to
you
look
to
at
see
it, look at page 401. I would read through it is honestly what I would do. We're not even going to go through it. Like, it's just, if they ask
I don't know
you,
that there's going to be a specific question
yeah,
about this.
yeah. If they ask you like specifically, like, well, outline the
What
budget
happens on April
process,
1st
like, yeah, you're
every
like,
year.
yeah. First of all, that's awful. They won't do that. Again, keep in mind it's complicated. It starts a year in advance. There's a lot of different players. But again, if you just remember in general, the president proposes, Congress actually writes it, and then the president has to give final approval, I think you'll be fine.
We've touched on this.
We've talked about this a lot. You talk about the fluctuating deficits again. You see that the biggest time when deficits occur is going to be when government spending increases without a simultaneous increase in taxes. So when in 2008 during the Great Financial Crisis, Obama and Congress they were trying to bail out banks and corporations that were about to go bankrupt. But he did not increase taxes at the same time, and you see this just gigantic, increase in the deficit. Same thing in 2001. Again, George W. Bush, cut taxes, but then increased spending with the war in Afghanistan. So this is just it's all related.
It was like really low in 2000 before we start war.
Well, because Clinton was the last one to. Oh, you see
Have a
here. So
balanced
so here,
budget.
no, it's
Yeah,
like this
yeah,
one.
yeah.
It's actually at
Right.
like they were
We were
actually
actually in the
operating.
green.
They were actually operating at a surplus.
Yeah, we had a surplus at that point.
Crazy, right?
Wow.
Okay, last one. Assess the impact of democratic politics on budgetary growth and of the budget on the scope of government.
Democracy and budgeting. So growth in government has been tied to democracy. So if you look historically through the United States, as our ideas of democracy have increased, so has our budget, so has our spending. Because again, the American people have kind of come to not rely on the government for all aspects of life, but rely on the government for a lot of different things. And because of that, we see an increase in, what we need for the budget and then an increase in spending as well. Do elites actually oppose big government? Well, they say they do, but when it comes to going back to kind of the 2008 financial crisis example, the government bailed out a lot of different corporations that needed it that were going to go under without the government's help. And so, yes, on the surface, elites oppose government, big government, but the government also helps them out a lot. And another example of how the government kind of works with these big corporations or elites is through contracts, like with Boeing. We spend a lot on military, and Boeing is the beneficiary of a lot of that money. And so you gotta kind of think about, do they actually oppose big government?
It's like I feel like corporations treat the government like a really bad friend. Like they don't ever want to hang out.
They talk bad about them all the time, but then when they need them,
yeah. But then hey, I need you to help me move.
bail me out.
And I'm not going to give you any pizza or beer. And then you're just like, oh, okay, I guess I'm going to go. Well, I guess we got to help you now.
Yep.
Continue, sorry.
And so another thing that kind of goes into how our budgeting and spending has expanded is, the increase in influence in interest groups. So interest groups, we have a ton, thousands of them in any given category in the United States. And they all want their piece of the budget too. So they're all going to lobby really hard to get money designated in their different areas as well. The U.S. government taxes and spends less. So when we've talked about this 100 times, but when we decrease taxes, we have less money coming in, which means our deficit is going to increase because we have things that we have to spend money on. And then that kind of changes where we can spend our discretionary money, right? So maybe we cut education because we have to keep spending on our interests or whatever it might be. The most common critique is failure to balance the budget. So this is true.
What do you cut?
I don't know. And as you've seen through this entire PowerPoint, the budget process is a nightmare. There's so much that goes into it, and balancing that at this point is going to be very difficult, if not impossible. And then we get to pork barrel spending. Pork barrel.
Well, but again, going back to pork barrel spending, everybody has a certain piece in there that is there that they're bringing home the bacon to their constituents. And so if somebody says, hey, we should probably cut this because it's not benefiting, a very large amount of people, that somebody is going to be opposed to that.
Right.
And so they don't want to cut out, nobody wants to cut out the thing that is going to get them reelected.
Yeah, and again, if I am representing a group of constituents who oppose that, and even if it's just a small group, I am not going to get reelected if I'm cutting that out for them. So it's kind of that power aspect too, is how can I continue to keep getting reelected or can keep getting my job back? And so that also kind of goes into the thought process when it comes to this.
You're right. The budget and the scope of government. Oh my gosh, I've waited so long to say this. The budget is the scope of government. Oh man. Again, when you talk, when we talk about the size of government, the amount of money that they spend and the amount of money that they make, that is what the scope of government is. So when the country has a need, the government is going to step up. Again, think about COVID, think about, the payments, things like that.
And we've just recently, we're in the summer of 2021 right now.
Yeah.
And the government has just recently passed an infrastructure bill. And the country's in desperate need for updates in our infrastructure. And this includes broadband, universal internet for everybody. This includes things like resources and funding to try to fight climate change and the effects of it. And so the government, this need has arisen in the last 20 years, and the government has to respond to that, which costs us more money.
Is universal internet really in the bill?
Yes, it is. Universal broadband.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Okay, so the last thing here is the politics of scarcity. There's never enough funds, and so they're literally like the congressmen are trying to make something out of essentially nothing. Like and it's a very difficult job.
Very difficult.
So, guys, this was lovely.
Yep.
Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll see you in the next one.